Dober dan vsem skupaj. Dobrodošli na drugem dnevu Založniške akademije. Danes se pogovarjamo o norveški knjižni politiki. Z mano sta dva kolega gosta iz Norveške. Gospod Zučali je Helge Rovning, zaslužni profesor na Univerzi v Oslu, kjer se ukvarja z komunikacijskimi študijami, njegova specialnost pa so knjižni trgi in knjige in knjižne politike. Ob njem gospod Brezočaj je torej Slota, ki je prav tako raziskovalec in avtor številnih študij o knjižnih trgih. Lani sta za potrebe frankfurtskega knjižnega sejma pripravila tole knjižico The Tools of Literary Politics, The Norwegian Model, v katerim govorita o pristopih, ki jih imajo na Norveškem za to, da ohranjajo in pospešujejo knjižno kulturo. Eden od razlogov, zakaj smo jih povabili na letošnji knjižni sejem v to debato, je seveda ta, da Norveško občasno uporabljamo kot primerjavo, predvsem glede bralnih navad za Slovenijo. Njihove bralne navade so namreč precej bolj razvite kot pri nas. Od te točke naprej bom seveda pogovor preklopil v angleščino in povzetek pogovora bo pa seveda na razpolago na spletni strani knjižnega sejma. I'm switching to English now. I've told a few jokes about you, and now in Slovenian, of course.
We understood everything.
Okay. So, I'll be more careful next time. So let's start with the first question. Norway is a country with quite highly developed reading habits. And in Slovenia, we sometimes use Norwegian data as a kind of a benchmark. More than 80% of population declares itself as book readers, and they actually do read books from time to time, whilst in Slovenia this number is much lower. It's about 50%. And my question is simple, and I assume the answer will be more complex. How did Norway achieve this? Because 50 years ago, the number of non-readers was higher than now. So Norway actually decreased the number of non-readers. And how is it possible to sustain such a relatively high reading habits in the times of scrims?
Well, this is a puzzle to some degree, but I think we would like to emphasize the active literary politics in Norway as one important explanation for this. It's been, let's say, a constant influence from literary politics since the 1960s. And it seems to be favorable for maintaining a wide range of authors and also giving literature a high standing in public culture. There is, of course, a very strong competition now from audiovisual media also in Norway, but it seems at the moment that literary culture is keeping up pretty good. Many explanations, of course, but I think, as I said, literary politics is important here.
I think it's also important to look at this in a historical perspective. If we look back 250 years from now, 270 years actually, we had, when Norway was part of Denmark, and also Sweden and Finland was part of Sweden, there was a joint impetus in the policy. So these four countries, and Iceland as well, which was part of Denmark, which was driven by the state church, the Lutheran state church, that all children in the 5 countries, or 3 countries and the territories, they should go through a course to be able to read the Bible in their own languages, as well as to be able to write their names. This took place in the 1730s, which meant that 70 years later, at around the turn of the century, between the 18th and the 19th century, there was virtual universal literacy in all the Nordic countries. And I think that's a very important part of the reason why literacy and the reading is such an important part of the cultures of these countries. So it's also important in this context to look at the importance of the national languages in all these countries. That to be able to read and write in your own language became part of the not only cultural policy, but the general policies of these countries, all for the past 220 years. And that, to me, is a very important element of that reading has been maintained as such as an important activity in all these countries. And then, of course, as Tore mentions, if we look at the post-Second World War period, cultural policies have become increasingly important in the 5 countries as not only part of a national policy for fostering national identity, but also for fostering a social cohesion in the countries. So cultural policies are not only cultural policies, they're part of the whole welfare state policy system. And I think that's an important element. And that means that education, the social welfare policies, and literary policies and cultural policies are part of the same system. And that means that, for instance, to foster libraries of all kinds in all these countries are an important element of providing not only reading material, but a social meeting place for the citizens of the countries. So today in Oslo, where we have just opened a new public city library, which is at the very center of the town, it serves as a meeting place much more than only a place where books live. It's a meeting place for social activities, for social encounters, for discussions, etc. So the whole library social policies are part of a big element of social life in these countries and in Norway.
Mm. So simply put, one of the secrets is that that cultural and educational policies are seen as a part of the welfare politics.
Absolutely.
In the society.
Yeah.
And this has a long tradition, I assume, in Norwegian.
Yeah, and as we also emphasize in our book, literary policies is much more than only the policy of reading in for your pleasure. It's also part of the whole knowledge building in the society. So the book as a medium is the most essential of the tools for building a knowledgeable society. And that's a very important part of how the reading is not only something that you do in your spare time, it's part of your whole life. And right now we're sitting in university. But this is not only the case for universities, it's also the case that people, when they want to know something, they go to a book. I have an anecdote about that. I have a friend who is a professor, grantedly. He was supposed to paint his house. And what did he do? He went to a bookstore and bought books about painting. And then he painted his house.
But why not searching for such data on the web? I mean,
this works.
What you see, what is the reason why these omnipresent screens hasn't eroded the reading culture in Norway yet?
I think a major explanation is that books are part of a larger print culture. And so still newspapers also are upheld as a fairly high activity reading papers, newspapers in print in Norway. So, even for the last years, it's still over 200 newspapers in Norway. It's been stable since the 1960s. It's pretty amazing, actually. So print is seemingly not going away very easily. And I think there might be a shift in the future, but as I think both the industry knows and the public seems to support it, that print books are still favorable for reading and favorable for the whole book industry as well. So it seems to be working as part of a print culture still.
And I think it also when there are surveys of how the students want their curricula, they say that they want them on paper and on print. So you would find that students who get their reading material on screen, they will print it out. And I think that's one of the real advantages. So, the printed paper is something that it's easier to relate to than the screen. It's not only for me personally, I'm an old man, but also for young people. They feel they relate better to what is on paper than to what is on the screen. The screen is fine for watching films. It's fine for what we are doing now, though it's much better to be together personally, as we have found out during these Zoom and Teams times. But I think that this relationship to the printed page is very much part of this, and it will continue, is my prediction.
It's if I could put in a little thing here, I think very important element in sustaining readership and reading culture in Norway is the existence of the bookshops. And that's an effect of much of the literary policies that we still have many hundreds bookshops all around the country. And 70% of all purchases are still made in bookstores. So, which that's the physical printed book still being.
That's actually what I wanted to ask you. I mean, in this little book of yours, you mention a lot of literary policies, but what would you see as the main tools for sustaining this big chain of bookstores and this quite big number of bookstores you have in Norway? How come that they are still surviving? I mean,
well,
is this just market, or are there other mechanisms behind?
No, I think reading culture is very much supported by the bookstores, the existence of bookstores, and also the library, which is a very high standing in Norwegian culture and Norwegian reading. And there's also been recently a public culture about literary events, which has been quite successful. So you might say there's been a loss of marketing through, there used to be much more advertisements and in newspapers for books, but I think the live performances and now also streamed author panel discussions about literature, all that has a prominent position in public culture in Norway. So that's very important for the reading. On the more production side, we have several measures that have been quite important, and maybe the most efficient, in my view, is, besides the VAT exemption, is a purchasing scheme where books are bought for the libraries and distributed through the libraries. But it's not every, but many of the new books being published are automatically being bought by the Arts Council, and then distributed through the libraries.
But my friend, this doesn't answer Mio's question about bookstores.
You go on.
Yeah. This is an answer, one of the answers about publishers, actually.
Yes.
I think the reason for there are many bookstores in Norway are three. First, that there is a tradition for having bookstores, even in relatively small communities. They've been there for a long time. You would find that if, for instance, if you go to a small town in Norway, you will find that there has always been a bookstore there. And that again was linked to that children at schools, and particularly in the secondary schools, they bought their books through this bookstore. Now it's also that bookstores are in chains, and the chains are very big here, and they are quite concentrated. There are three main chains at the moment, but there are also quite a few important independent bookstores. But these bookstores are organized in the Booksellers Association. And the Booksellers Association negotiate with the Publishers Association, even if two of the bookstore chains are owned by publishers. They are still separate entities. And they negotiate about prices, they negotiate about advances, etc. And sales and purchase campaigns. That's one reason. The other one is the fixed price agreement between the booksellers and the publishers, which is an incentive for people to buy books in bookstores. So the fixed price is not only good for authors and for publishers, they're also very important for booksellers, because that means that people can buy the same book all over the country to the same price, all the new books. And that's a way of upholding the system of bookstores all over the country. If we compare the situation in free price countries such as Denmark, after they introduced the free price in Denmark, or in Sweden, which is countries that are comparable to Norway, and also in relation to Britain, we have seen that with the introduction of free prices, the number of bookstores have been decreasing dramatically. And so this is a very important element in it. But I would also then point to the fact that when a bookstore becomes a central element in the social life of small communities, it's where people, like in libraries, they meet in the bookstores. It's in Norway, we also have a state monopoly for buying alcohol. So in a way, a bookstore and the store for buying wine are more or less the same sort of social element in the community. You need both books and alcohol.
Yeah. Well, I would be very happy as a person involved in book business if Slovenians would consume similar amounts of books than they consume alcohol. But going back to this fixed prices issue, I mean, we have quite a heated debate now about fixed prices because the government decided to suspend the law for about a year and a half. And my question is, do you do any evaluations of fixed prices legislation? How do you know that it's good for the bookstores?
Well, we did an evaluation some years ago. It has been updated in various countries. We did a European survey of all kinds of material and discussed the fixed price system in various countries, in European countries. And I think Netherlands is the country who's been most recently evaluating it, and they have mostly found it's hard to actually give hard evidence, but you find supporting indications that this works to the benefit of authors and to the benefit of readers. So, I mean, you can't, it will never, the discussions will never go away, so to speak, because there's always people who will argue more on the basis of ideology. And but the data that we went through was overwhelmingly saying that fixed price systems works to the benefit of readers and or lower prices for books generally, and also much more favorable for having a wide range of authors to survive from writing. And so it's a much more system for equal competition between a wide range of authors, and you don't give such a privileged position for bestsellers. So that's the evidence we could produce, and it has been sustained. And the fixed price system is, in our view, the preferred model for European countries at the moment. Also supported by the EU agricultural policies.
But that does not mean that there is no discussion about this in Norway. It's really a very heated argument. There is very heated arguments about it in Norway at the moment, and partly to do that when the present government, which is a center-right government, took over power, they scrapped the book law that had been recently introduced by the Social Democratic government, and now there is not a book law. There is an agreement between the Publishers Association and the Booksellers Association, which has to receive the permission from the competition authorities to have such an agreement, because it's looked upon as being contrary to competition, and the competition regulators are actually in opposition to the fixed book price, while the government has so far accepted that in the book business there should be fixed book prices, but it's steadily open and up for discussion. We and others who have looked into this from various points of view, both economic and cultural policy reasons, find that both fixed book price do work for the benefit of readers, book buyers, as well as for publishers and booksellers, as well as for authors. So that's very important, that all the elements in the book trade are actually benefiting from fixed book prices. But there is discussion about it, and very much of that discussion is, in my opinion, an ideological discussion. And because books are in some way or other always related to issues of ideology. So I think that's it. And it's also should be mentioned in that this again has to do with the system of media policies in Norway, where we have this system of press subsidies for newspapers and other forms, and the public service broadcasting is very strong. So you can see book policies not only as part of the literary scene, but as the full media policy remit.
If I go just for a second back to this fixed prices issue, if I understood properly your book, the system in Norway works in a way that it puts obligations also in the side of booksellers, because they have to maintain the books in their stock of the publishers who obey this legislation. Is this correct?
That is very important, because it means that anyone can get any Norwegian book, as long as it's been part of the fixed book agreement, anywhere in Norway at the same price. That means that a book will cost the same in Oslo as it will in the furthermost part of Norway.
There's also a subscription system that many bookstores are into, which gives them one copy of the book for a very low price that they can sell. So they subscribe to a wide range of newly published books and have them in their store. even though it might be not a big sale for many books, but they have the chance to be exposed for the public in the bookstore. So they actually have a kind of library function through this subscription system in the bookstore.
But on the other hand, it must also be mentioned that the chains of bookstores, they have a system between them where they actually have certain sales preferences that they want the bestsellers to be in their stores, etc. And then, of course, what is also important in relation to this is the kind of price agreements that exist in the fixed book price agreement between publishers and bookstores, so that they cannot take too high an advance on the books that they sell, which is very important, because that means that the big stores cannot outcompete the small stores in relation to this.
But in general, one could say that the fixed price system in Norway works in a way that practically any book could be bought in all the bookstores either at the time when one enters the bookstores or by order to that bookstore in a day or two.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I have one more question, because this is very interesting from a Slovenian perspective, because same as in Norway, two biggest bookstore chains are owned by publishers. And then we have one a little bit smaller bookstore chain, which is also owned by publishers. And there is always a kind of understanding that, and there is also a quite high level of mistrust to this system, especially among smaller Slovenian publishers, because they don't want to see their big competitors what is selling well, and they always have this feeling that these bookstore chains somehow prefer the books from their owners. How are Norwegian publishers and booksellers handling this kind of problems?
That's a good question. I think there are the same issues are discussed in Norway, I would say, but I think there is a pressure because we have all these policy measures that works in the favor of the industry. They are put under an obligation to keep an arm's length to their bookstores. So the bookstores are actually surveilled quite a lot for their sort of neutrality, I would call it. So they are supposed to be handling all publishers on equal terms. So that this is actually have been documented also in surveys that they actually do that, and it's more complaints from also the big publishers that they don't really have any control of what the bookstores are doing. So the power has shifted very much from being publisher driven to being the high autonomy of the bookstores. But of course,
this is regardless the ownership of the bookstores.
Yes, but this is, I mean, it is still criticized. Small publishers will claim that they are left out, and so there's an ongoing discussion. But I think that the expectations also from the competition authorities will be that this neutrality principle, this arm's length principle, should be overheld.
And then, of course, there's the book face.
Yes, that's a very important element here.
What's that?
You explain.
It is a fortunate situation, I think, that Norway have developed a digital platform for handling the metadata of the booksellers. So all the publishers, small and large, will go onto the same digital platform and register their books. So every bookstore can have the whole access to the whole market, if you like, within one digital platform. So the data system works for the benefit of this.
Everyone.
For everyone, yes.
And who runs this platform?
It's a company, a separate company, which is owned by several publishers. So mostly the large ones, but it is still also maintained at arm's length principle and open for everyone. It's on driven on a market principle. So they are actually, if you buy the program, you buy into it, you will have the whole range. So any competitor, any actor in the publishing industry can access these data. Not the sales data of each company, of course, but the access, the available books, whether they are available in stock and so on, all that is on one digital platform.
So this is a kind, in old publishing language, one would say this is a kind of books in print system. Okay.
And it's a digital platform, so you can order from it. You know, it's a way of. It should be said that this is also under discussion, and the competition authorities are not happy with it. But at the moment, it functions. So I think that while we're talking about this as a general policy element, it's also so that these general policy elements that we're talking about now, it's not without its discussions, and there are criticisms saying that this is too much of a monopolistic situation. But then on the other hand, we also have to look into this, in our opinion, as part of a very important element of the history of Norwegian policies, which is called the mixed policy system, which actually goes back to the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, when Norway was being modernized from being a very poor country in Europe, that we had a system of where the state provided the infrastructure, private initiative used the infrastructure in order to develop businesses and industries, and the people who worked and were part of the civil society organized in relation to both the state and the private businesses. And this is very much part also of the Norwegian literary system, where the publishers are privately owned, the state provides infrastructure through its policy elements, and the organizations owe authors and of course the publishers, as well as the booksellers, are part of an organizational civil society system that also enters into negotiations with the other partners. So it's a very fine-tuned system of elements that agree and disagree and sort of balance each other. And then, of course, it also is linked to the policy decisions taken through parliamentary, the parliament on a national scale, and through the communal decision makers, policy decision makers on a local level.
So, simply put, if I understand you correctly, there is a lot of negotiations between different players in the market, and the secret is in finding proper compromise and in finding proper tools that allows this compromise to become alive.
Yes,
this is very important. I think the way the civic organizations are working, the authors organizations and the publishers association, they are working very much together, finding solutions, as you say, and so that's a very, maybe a very important and a little bit secret element of the success.
But it should also be mentioned then that in relation to the contracts between authors and publishers, they are not in agreement. So there are quite hard negotiations over contracts in Norway. It should be mentioned that contrary to most European countries, Norway has standard contracts between publishers and authors organizations, which means that the contracts are stipulated when it comes to, for instance, royalty, etc., and also decisions of how many books should be published in the first edition, etc., etc. So it's a very complicated but also very advanced system of agreements and disagreements. At the moment, there is a lot of discussion among authors that the audiobook agreement is not favorable. So they want the audiobook agreement to be renegotiated. And that again has to do with the fact that the audiobook publishers, if you can call them that, the companies, they are coming in as a new player in this very well-regulated system. And they are not regulated and part of the negotiations the same way. And they are also partly owned by big Swedish companies.
You're talking about Storytel, of course.
For instance, yeah, but there are others.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, if I was a Norwegian author and I would publish a novel, right now I would come to the publisher and publisher would say, yes, this is a brilliant book. Yeah. Then the contract I would get would be standardized in a way that I would know in advance what kind of royalties would I receive. So there would be no negotiations.
You would know what kind of royalty you would get. You would know what kind of first edition there would be. You would know what advance you would be getting. You would know everything about how this, and you would know what kind of secondary primary rights you have. You would know that your book would enter into, from the author's side, into the agreement about secondary rights in the Reprographic Rights Society, as well as for the publisher's side.
And you would know that the book would be purchased by into the library system. So there would be a guaranteed sale for many books. And so you would be able to know your income in the future.
So no negotiations, all negotiations would be done by authors and publishers for everyone involved in this. Well, that's very interesting. Speaking about Norwegian authors, I mean, Norway is also quite well known because of its authors, and I will not start, or I could be starting with Knut Hamsun, but I won't, because this is different times.
Or you could start with Henrik Ibsen.
Okay, yes, that's politically more correct, let's say.
Or Bjørne Bjørnson.
Yes, of course. But I mean, if we look at contemporary Norwegian fiction, there are quite a few very successful authors like Jo Nesbø or Maja Lunde and so on and so forth. So is behind this success of Norwegian authors abroad also a kind of policy, or is this just a coincidence?
It is, I think it is a result of the policy, but of course, authors are authors. They are the ones who make literature. So policy doesn't make literature in itself, but it has been beneficial. I think, what can we understand? Is Norway giving opportunities for authors that are relevant, that books being written that are relevant for public culture elsewhere as well? I think so, but we at the moment we are just in a good flow. I think literature is reproduced. Quality books are, one good author makes other better. So that's a kind of domino effect of it, and also the whole system with journals and print culture and criticism is very much alive around literature. So I think that's maintaining a fairly high quality of authors, many authors in Norway.
I think it also. I think it is part of a history that at the beginning of 19th century, Scandinavian literature and the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century Scandinavian literature became part of a very important modernizing ideology in Europe. We can look at great writers from the late 19th century, such as Strindberg and Ibsen, for instance, who actually were looked upon as being at the forefront of the modern literature, particularly in Germany. And then came other very famous authors, such as Hamsun and Sigrid Undset later. But this is part of an element which is traditional, but when you have a long tradition of literature that is looked upon as being at the center of modern literature, that means that the old ones sort of pull the younger ones with them. And then as part of the wish to introduce Norwegian literature in a wider international context, that was formed actually at the initiative of the publishers as well as the authors or associations, a new organization which is called Norwegian Literature Abroad, which then got support from the state, from the Ministry of Culture, to act as a, shall we say, a central for promoting Norwegian literature internationally. And this is an organization that is not a government department, it's an organization that is outside the state, but based on the organizations in the literary system. So they have been promoting literature, Norwegian literature abroad, and they provide grants for publishing, they provide grants for translations, so that in a way it's also part of the way of providing for a broader way of looking at literature as part of an important element of Norwegian policy in general. You might look upon it as a form of Norwegian soft power initiative, and that's what it is in many ways, but it's also a way of making Norwegian literature as part of a broader context internationally. And it's also important that this does not only support fiction, it supports also literature that are linked to the knowledge, to fact, to scientific literature, research-based literature, social sciences, for instance. And so this is a part of the whole way of looking upon culture as being part of the whole fabric of Norwegian society. And Norla was very important in relation to the Norwegian participation in Frankfurt last year.
So one could say that these policies are a kind of a mixture of state and private initiatives, in the way that state provides grants, but then authors are represented abroad by literary agents who operate as private companies.
Yeah,
Did I get this right?
This is what I call the Norwegian system. The state provides funding and infrastructure. Private initiatives provide the business acumen, and the civil society promotes and provides the organizational aspect of it.
It's a very important element in this. It sounds sometimes too corporativistic, but I think a very important element here is that there's this arm's length principle, and the autonomy of the organizations is really important. For instance, you say the grants are given by the state. Yes, the money are provided by the state, but the grants are actually given by the authors' organizations, and through autonomy screening, independent screening of authors reading authors. So it's a kind of independent decisions of the civil organizations, not the state. The state is not deciding who's getting the grants.
You mentioned this independent screening. Who does this?
Authors.
Committees yes. Being set up. I mean, for instance, if you go to the Cultural Council, which covers all types of arts, all types of cultural initiatives, from group theater companies, independent orchestras, to books, to festivals, etc. It's an independent state entity, but all its work is being done by committees that are being renewed every second year with new people being appointed. So that there is this arm's length, and the politicians cannot enter into what is happening in the Cultural Council or the Cultural Council, Arts Council, Cultural Council committees. And so there is this element all the time of that the state is important, but the state should not be too powerful.
And there is a consensus between left and right political parties in Norway that this should be so.
That's a dream. But of course, there is always attempts, criticism that the arm's length is not working. There's critique that the arts organizations are too strong. There's always critique, but I think there's a democratic impetus in this, because the member organizations are actually suggesting who will become the next member of these committees, several committees around in the whole, call it a system. So, the organizations give legitimacy to the process of screening, but the turnover is very important. You can't sit there for more than 2 years, you elect and so on. So this gives a strong support, legitimacy through the organization and the members of the organizations.
And let me also say that something that we have not talked about so far, but that's part of it as well. That's the legislation, the judicial system here, which is very important. We have a very strong copyright or authors' rights legislation, which actually provides for very strong protection of intellectual property and cultural property. And that's a very important element, of course, in relation both to the right of authors, but also in relation to the rights of publishers. And we also have a system with secondary rights protection in all artistic areas, music, film, visual culture, as well as written culture, through CMOs, through collecting management organizations. So this is part of it. And secondly, of course, also as in all democratic countries, the provisions for protecting freedom of expression is extremely important and extremely well taken care of. So every time someone tries to make a little dent into that, then it will be a real uproar. So in the Norwegian clause for freedom of expression in the Norwegian constitution, it says that it's the duty of the state authorities to provide for an open and free public discourse. And that means that this is part of the reason for having cultural support, a strong public service broadcaster, support for mass media in the form of newspapers, even the newspapers and everything that is critical of the state, that's looked upon as being extremely important.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so let's go to one more topic, which is actually Frankfurt Book Fair. Norway was guest of honor last year when there was last normal Frankfurt Book Fair. Hopefully not last normal book fair ever, but and Slovenia will be guest of honor in 2023. And if I understood correctly, the Norwegian appearance in Frankfurt was seen as a success. At least Frankfurt Book Fair leadership was quite happy with it. Was the same in Norway?
I think it was a success when we were there. I think with all people involved, thought that it was well organized. It went as planned, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, what happened in March 2020 has stopped what was most important, namely the post effect of rising sales and interaction and exposure of Norwegian literature abroad. So this is the situation with the Corona situation has actually made it very difficult to evaluate the effects of Frankfurt. But there and then, I think we were very happy.
But as with all events such as this, it should be mentioned that there was quite a debate beforehand in Norway whether Norway should be there a guest of honor or not, because people were saying it costs so and so much money that could be used for other purposes in the literary circle. But we do think, but I should also mention one thing, which was one of the reasons why I think the Frankfurt Book Fair felt that this was such a success. And that was that the initiative, which came from actually independent Norwegian organizations, in the last weekend of April last year, we had a big German-Norwegian book festival in Oslo, where 5,000 people participated at the Literature House in Oslo in discussions, meetings, and readings of an equal number of German and Norwegian authors. So we said, I was one of the people who took the initiative to this, we said that so much is being known now in Germany about Norwegian literature, but so little is being known in Norway about contemporary German literature. So let's try to find out what is the reciprocity between German and Norwegian literature. So we organized this Norwegian-German literary festival with participants from all the German-speaking countries in order to find out how the Frankfurt Book Fair should not only be a way for promoting literature to the rest of the world, but also for the Norwegian audience to learn about the literature of Germany. And I think that was a very important element in this, the whole focus on the Frankfurt Book Fair. And it was
this was very well received by the Frankfurt administration as well, of course. And I think also to understand for Slovenia into 2023 that you should really build on any relationship you have to Germany, because German culture, German literature, that's the way in. And the success of Norwegian literature very much comes from the high attention that we receive from the German market. I mean, Norwegian authors seem to go through Germany and then to the rest of the world. So that's a very important gate.
And then, of course, what we also found, which was very important, was that quite a few of the authors who came to Frankfurt, and also when we had this German literature event in Oslo, was that it's important to also use Germany and the German language as a way of entering into an international market. And I think that it's important for Slovenia, like for Norway, was that to also promote the importance of having a national language, which is not only being overwhelmed all the time by English, but that to maintain the importance of the national language, and in Norway of Norwegian, not only as a language for art, but also as a language for science, as a language for research, as a language for promoting the debate about international issues.
Well, I couldn't agree more about this last point. But I have one more, let's say, more practical question. Can you say a few words how this Norwegian presence in Frankfurt was organized? I mean, who decided and how the decision was taken, what will be presented, what will be the design of the Norwegian pavilion, all this practical stuff which goes together with such a big promotion?
I would be very happy to give you a lot of details on this. I sat on the board of NORLA, the Norwegian Organization for Literature Abroad.
And how many people were in this board?
I think we were 6 people, and that's representatives from the authors' organizations and the publishers and the organization itself. So and the library, National Library. That's the organization. And that was the organization that was spearheading the whole operation.
So it was not the Ministry of Culture, it was NORLA as an organization.
Yes. So, I mean, you ask a big question, but I think the autonomy of this organization and the way they brought all the organizations together was very important. And there was many good decisions made by this board, and also a good hiring of a director for the whole process. Was very fortunate. I think the work that had been done successfully over the years were sort of we knew, as you do, 4 or 5 years ahead. 2019 will be the year. So everyone was working together to make it happen. Then actually the government provided some money, so it came into being, but it was already well planned.
So if I understand you correctly, there was this board of 6 persons, and there was also the director of the whole project.
Yes, plus.
But it was he was assigned to the organization.
But he was assigned to the organization and hired by the organization.
Yes.
And what was his job, the job of the director?
Well, he was the, let's say, the producer of the whole, together with the director of the NORLA organization. So they were always working in tandem, but he was the project coordinator.
And it should be mentioned that he had also been the project coordinator of the Icelandic participation.
So he was not a Norwegian person?
No, he was Icelandic.
Speaking Danish.
So it was like in football, you hired a foreigner.
Exactly.
We hired a manager, an Icelandic manager.
And it was,
but it should also be mentioned that part of the experiences that we built on then was also the experiences from the Finnish participation in Frankfurt. So it is part of as I said, I think that we should start to look upon this as a joint Nordic way of looking at culture policies. It's not only Norwegian.
And just one more technical question. How many years before the Norwegian appearance in Frankfurt you hired the director of the project?
No, he was hired 2 years before.
3 years before?
1.5 years before. So, but he, he had done it before. So that was a very fortunate situation. It was, as always, you work to a date and it's coming too fast, and you always stumble on the last bit. But no, I think it went fine. And having done it before, we knew, we learned. And we cooperated very early with the Frankfurt administration, which also is very professional, I would say. This is a very collective work, and of course, again, it wouldn't have been possible without the support of the authors and the support also of the public and the government.
So, but
as well as the press
and the press, yes,
and the public service broadcaster,
yes, and the princess.
Well, we don't have the princess, but we have everything else. So, but if I understand you correctly, you have actually this project coordinator of the director and the board of 6 persons, and most of the work was done in this circle.
Yes.
No, the work was
the planning was done.
The planning, yes, of course, and the concept of all the things.
It was being done by the people who worked at Norla.
Norla is
of course.
It's a 20-30 people staff. So
it was done by the staff of Norla, plus additional staff that was hired for the purpose of the fair itself.
And it was a very important cooperation also with the foreign ministry, of course, and with the embassy in Berlin. All this were coordinated, very important coordination.
Okay, well, we just rounded this 1 hour talk. I'm very grateful that you participated in this discussion, and I'm very sorry that I don't have you here in Ljubljana. Because if you were here, we could go now for a nice lunch.
Would love to be there.
I can just say now that I owe you one. And hopefully we will see each other sometimes in Ljubljana, or if not in Ljubljana, then hopefully next year, at least in Frankfurt.
At least in Frankfurt.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.